On the surface, Lady Kathleen Cavendish seemed to have it all: beauty, privilege, and the iconic Kennedy name. But behind the dazzling facade of wealth and influence lay a story filled with heartbreak, scandal, and a sense of inevitable tragedy. Known to her family as Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy, she was part of one of America's most powerful and ill-fated dynasties. Born to Joseph and Rose Kennedy, Kathleen grew up alongside figures who would go on to define American history, her brothers John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy among them. But even as a child, she felt the weight of a dark shadow following her family's triumphs. She once whispered to a cousin, "Will we always live under these heavy clouds?" It was a chilling hint of the tragedies that would plague the Kennedys for generations. Kathleen's spirit was vibrant and full of curiosity, earning her the nickname Kick for her restless energy. But it often clashed with the strict Irish Catholic rules of the Kennedy household. Her mother, Rose, demanded perfection, but Kathleen quietly rebelled. During tense family dinners, when Rose reminded her to lower her voice, Kathleen would grip her fork in frustration, silently thinking, "I can't be the perfect daughter you want." Yet those small acts of defiance were only the surface of the deeper struggles she carried. The Kennedy family projected an image of strong values, but they hid their darkest secrets behind closed doors. The most harrowing example was Kathleen's sister, Rosemary Kennedy. Rosemary had an intellectual disability, a truth the family desperately tried to hide to preserve their public image. One afternoon, Kathleen overheard quiet sobs behind a locked door and timidly asked, "Mother, what's wrong?" Rose's clipped reply, "It's nothing, Kathleen," offered no comfort. Kathleen later learned the devastating truth. Rosemary had been subjected to a lobotomy, a procedure that left her silenced and incapacitated for life. The realization shook Kathleen to her core, exposing the lengths to which her parents would go to maintain appearances. Joseph Kennedy, the family patriarch, presented a polished public image but lived a life guided by ego and self-indulgence. Marriage vows to him were nothing more than suggestions. Even as a child, Kathleen noticed the tension when her father flaunted his mistresses in front of her mother. In one awkward encounter, she dared to confront him. "Father, why is Miss Swanson here again?" Joseph dismissed her with a patronizing, "This is grown-up business," kick. Her cheeks burned with shame as she walked away, confused and humiliated. Hollywood starlets like Gloria Swanson and Marlene Dietrich became regular guests in Joseph's private world. Kathleen found herself fascinated yet disturbed by their glamorous presence. Once she whispered to her brother, "Do you think these women like us or just him?" She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that she was witnessing something transactional, adult relationships far beyond her understanding. Joseph Kennedy's behavior extended beyond his private affairs. He attempted to normalize his scandals by blending his mistress's children into family life. Kathleen once attended a party with young Gloria Swanson's daughter, but something about the forced cheeriness felt deeply wrong. Years later, Kathleen would recall thinking, "I knew this was supposed to seem like a friendly gathering, but I felt like Father was playing a game." Torn between loyalty and an emerging awareness of manipulation, she was left grappling with emotions too heavy for her young shoulders. The tension escalated further when Kathleen's friends began avoiding the Kennedy household. They whispered about Joseph lingering too long in the basement screening room when they were alone. One day, a close friend nervously turned down Kathleen's invitation to watch a film, admitting, "Your father, he makes me uncomfortable." Kathleen froze, horror and humiliation flooding her. She fled upstairs, tears welling up, powerless to protect her friends or herself from the unsettling reality she couldn't control. Amidst the family's dysfunction, Kathleen made a bold and unconventional choice. While the Kennedy household was dominated by Joseph's authority, she sided openly with her mother, Rose, positioning herself as Rose's defender against Joseph's infidelities. Kathleen hoped her loyalty would bring them closer, but her devotion was often met with silence and coldness. She would look at her mother and plead, "I'm with you, Mother. Why won't you say anything?" But Rose, bound by societal expectations and her own struggles, would simply turn away. Kathleen's heartache only deepened, yet her resolve to hold her ground grew stronger. Kathleen's life wasn't a fairy tale. She was torn between family duty and her own dreams. She yearned to break free from the shadows of her family's secrets and expectations, but the weight of the Kennedy curse loomed over her at every step. No matter how hard she tried to carve her own path, the darkness that clung to the Kennedy name would eventually come for her too, stealing away her freedom and her future. Her life, full of contradictions, courage, and heartbreak, remains a haunting chapter in the Kennedy family legacy, a reminder that beneath even the most glamorous surfaces, there are cracks that run deep. Beyond the family drama, Kathleen struggled with insecurities that many debutantes faced in a world where physical beauty often opened doors. By traditional standards, she wasn't seen as a classic beauty. People often pointed to her high stoop, thick neck, frizzy hair, and unremarkable figure. At one social gathering, Kathleen overheard a cruel remark. "She's a Kennedy, all right, but not exactly a swan." That comment stung, but she refused to show it. Later that night, she forced a laugh with a friend and said, "So, I'm no Grace Kelly. I'll find other ways to shine, won't I?" Even though self-doubt nagged at her, Kathleen wouldn't let anyone else decide her worth. What Kathleen lacked in conventional beauty, she more than made up for with her wit, energy, and infectious sense of humor. Her brothers loved to tease her about her tomboy antics, and she'd fire back with a cheeky grin, "Careful, Jack, or I'll outrun you to the end of the lane." Her spirited attitude set her apart, earning her respect where it mattered most. Rather than crumble under scrutiny, Kathleen embraced her quirks and used them to bring joy and light into any room she entered. Surrounded by her brother's friends, handsome, athletic boys, Kathleen's energy proved irresistible. While she didn't fit the typical mold of a society belle, these young men were drawn to her spark and bold charm. Before long, they lingered near the Kennedy family home, hoping to catch her attention. Her mother, Rose, wasn't having it. She warned sternly, "Kathleen, these boys are not your future." With a defiant tilt of her chin, Kathleen would reply, "Maybe not, Mother, but they're here now." Each flirtation was a small act of rebellion, hinting at cracks in the pristine image Rose was so desperate to preserve. Alarmed by Kathleen's growing interest in red-blooded American jocks, Rose decided to take drastic measures. She sent Kathleen to an all-girls convent school, hoping to isolate her daughter from temptation and protect the family's reputation. As the car pulled away, Kathleen looked at her mother and softly pleaded, "Mother, you can trust me." Rose said nothing, leaving Kathleen to wonder if this move was about keeping scandal away or keeping her independent spirit under control. Despite Rose's attempts to rein her in, Kathleen's romantic interests didn't disappear, they simply evolved. When she began dating Peter Grace, a wealthy heir, the choice reflected a kind of compromise. Peter wasn't the carefree athlete she once flirted with. He was respectable, well-connected, and came from deep pockets. A suitor her parents might approve of, or at least tolerate. But even as she spent time with Peter, Kathleen found herself questioning her feelings. Is this what they want, or what I want? She'd sigh quietly, torn between genuine connection and living up to her family's expectations. After finishing school, Kathleen's world grew even larger. Her father, Joseph Kennedy, had been appointed U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, which gave Kathleen an entrance into London's elite circles. At 18, she attended the famous Queen Charlotte's Ball, the most prestigious debutante event of its kind. To everyone's surprise, including her own, Kathleen was named Debutante of the Year in 1938. Later that evening, while sharing drinks with a friend, she laughed triumphantly. Who would have thought? Me, the scrappy American, charming the Brits. In that moment, Kathleen felt like she was finally writing her own story, one free from the heavy shadows of her family name. What truly set Kathleen apart was her boldness, a trait that shocked and enchanted the British aristocracy in equal measure. Unlike the demure, soft-spoken young ladies who floated quietly along ballroom walls, Kathleen sauntered forward with confidence, unafraid to speak her mind. When a British lord remarked, "I've never met a young lady so forward," Kathleen responded with a mischievous grin, "Then you haven't met many ladies like me." Her candor was refreshing, her energy infectious, and her refusal to conform made her stand out in a sea of quiet elegance. Kathleen's ability to balance charm with rebellion elevated her status in London's social scene, but it also set her on a path that would later create tension. She was a Kennedy after all, expected to follow a carefully planned course, one dictated by duty and tradition. Yet Kathleen seemed determined to play by her own rules, embracing life with an irreverence that both thrilled and unsettled those around her. Her story reveals a young woman torn between two worlds, one of privilege and expectation, and the other of freedom and self-discovery. Even as Kathleen dazzled the aristocracy, her bold choices hinted at a future where she would defy convention, for better or worse. Her journey was just beginning, but already the cracks in the Kennedy image were beginning to show. In 1939, war erupted across Europe, and danger began to close in. While visiting a friend's family home in France, Kathleen suddenly learned that German forces were mobilizing. The news triggered a desperate rush to escape. As she scrambled to pack a suitcase, her hands trembled slightly, fear prickling at her spine. "We need to leave now," her companion urged. Kathleen swallowed her panic and forced her voice to sound steady. "Yes, let's go." She made it back to London, but the safety she hoped for there remained out of reach. War was closing in, reshaping her world yet again. It was a harsh reminder that no matter how far she traveled or how brightly she tried to shine, the shadows of history and the weight of her family's expectations were never far behind. As Europe slipped deeper into chaos, the Kennedy family decided it was time to return to America. Joseph Kennedy, in his role as U.S. ambassador to Britain, needed to prioritize his safety and position. Kathleen, however, felt differently. She had fallen in love with England's quiet resilience, its deep traditions, and perhaps something or someone more personal. When her parents announced their decision to leave, Kathleen couldn't hide her dismay. "Leave me here, please. I can manage on my own," she pleaded. But her mother rose, pressed her lips into a thin, disapproving line, and her father responded with a firm shake of the head. No words, no explanations, just finality. At that moment, Kathleen felt something inside her snap. Tears burned the corners of her eyes as the painful truth set in. They would never let her make her own choices, no matter how much she fought for independence. Her hopes were crushed beneath the weight of her father's authority, and she knew there was no swaying him. In the fall of 1939, Kathleen boarded a ship back to the United States, her heart heavy with anger and sadness. Outwardly, she maintained a mask of reluctant obedience, but inside, a storm raged. Over quiet dinners in the family's American home, Kathleen would break the silence with a bitter truth. "I never wanted to leave England." Her words were often met with awkward silences or hasty changes of subject. as if her feelings didn't matter. Kathleen knew there was more to her longing. If circumstances had been different, perhaps a certain someone might have convinced her parents to let her stay. But that chance had slipped away, leaving her with a void she couldn't fill. Restless and enraged, Kathleen refused to sit idle. Behind closed doors, she began plotting her next move, determined to reclaim the independence that had been stolen from her. She would find her way back to the place she loved, no matter what it took. Trapped back in America, Kathleen felt adrift. She enrolled in schools but dropped out, tried her hand at newspaper writing, and floated through high society events without any real sense of purpose. Late at night, she would sometimes open up to a cousin, whispering, "I feel like I'm waiting for something that's never going to come." The laughter and confidence that had defined her time in London had been replaced by a growing restlessness. With each passing day, the life she'd left behind felt farther away, fueling a quiet determination that something had to change. By 1943, Kathleen had reached her breaking point. She decided to return to England on her own terms, even if that meant stepping into a war zone. Without hesitation, she volunteered to work at an English Red Cross center for servicemen. When her mother confronted her, horrified by the decision, Kathleen stood her ground. "I'll be fine. You can't keep me locked away forever," she said firmly. But deep down, Kathleen knew her motivations weren't purely idealistic. England wasn't just a place she loved. It held a key to her past and to her heart that America never could. As Europe was gripped by the devastation of World War II, life in England became defined by air raid sirens, bomb shelters, and ration lines. London, once a vibrant city, was now cloaked in darkness, with families bracing for nightly bombings during the Blitz. Kathleen witnessed firsthand how the war reshaped not just landscapes, but the spirit of an entire nation. For the British aristocracy, titles and wealth provided little shelter from the grim realities of war. Even the grandest estates were repurposed as hospitals, shelters, or training grounds. It was within this environment of resilience and shared sacrifice that Kathleen's admiration for England deepened, and where her bond with Billy Hardington grew stronger. While her privileged upbringing in America shielded her from such hardships, Kathleen found herself inspired by England's quiet courage. Her decision to return to a war-torn country and volunteer for the Red Cross was not simply impulsive. It reflected her determination to play a meaningful role in a world engulfed by chaos. Once back on English soil, Kathleen set out to reconnect with Billy Hardington, the quiet aristocrat she had met during her earlier days in Britain. Their reunion was cautious at first, filled with unspoken emotions. Over tea one afternoon, she teased him gently, "You haven't changed a bit, Billy." Still as steady as ever, trying to mask the spark of excitement in her eyes. Billy's calm smile and measured words gave her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. In him, Kathleen found a steady counterbalance to her own restless and lively spirit. But beneath Billy's quiet demeanor lay a surprising depth, and a legacy that would challenge everything they knew about love and loyalty. It wasn't long before Kathleen uncovered the full truth about Billy. He wasn't just the kind-hearted man she adored. He was William Hardington, the heir to the Duke of Devonshire's title and fortune. The realization brought both excitement and unease. During an evening walk through a picturesque English garden, she turned to him and said, with a mix of wonder and trepidation, "Goodness, Billy, I never thought I'd find myself courting a future duke." Billy blushed, but acknowledged what Kathleen already knew. While their worlds overlapped in privilege, they were still divided. His wealth might have satisfied the Kennedy family's high standards, but his Protestant faith stood in direct conflict with their strict Irish Catholic beliefs. Letters began arriving at Kathleen's doorstep, each one sharper and more desperate than the last. "This is not the match we raised you for," one letter declared. Kathleen sat by candlelight, reading the words aloud to Billy, her voice trembling. "They don't understand you," she murmured, "and I'm not sure they ever will." In that moment, Kathleen realized how deeply her family's prejudices ran. The love she had found felt genuine and strong, but it also carried a cost that weighed heavy on her heart. Kathleen's relationship with her mother, Rose Kennedy, grew increasingly strained as she made choices that defied the family's strict values. Rose's opposition was relentless, especially when it came to Kathleen's love for Billy Hartington, a Protestant and heir to a British dukedom. Letters filled with warnings and disapproval arrived constantly, and Rose refused to understand Kathleen's happiness. "Mother, you have to see how happy he makes me," Kathleen pleaded, but her words fell on deaf ears. Torn between her love for Billy and the weight of her family's expectations, Kathleen found herself more isolated than ever. Billy Hartington's quiet nature concealed a strong resolve, and when it came to matters of faith, he would not compromise. Eventually, he proposed to Kathleen just as they had dreamed, but with one difficult condition. "If we marry," he said softly, meeting her gaze, "our children must be Protestant." Kathleen's heart sank. This was the moment she had dreaded, the ultimate test of her loyalty to love and family. She swallowed hard and nodded, knowing that while she was willing to make this sacrifice for Billy, a part of her would always regret it. Her acceptance of Billy's proposal only fueled Rose Kennedy's fury. Unable to comprehend why her daughter would betray the family's faith, Rose launched a relentless campaign to sabotage the relationship. The letters kept coming, full of warnings and judgment. Invitations to social events mysteriously vanished, and visits between Kathleen and Billy were increasingly difficult, as Rose invented reasons to keep them apart. "Mother," Kathleen cried in frustration one day, "I love him. Can't you see that?" But Rose's silence spoke louder than words, cold, unwavering, and merciless. Kathleen had fought so hard to choose her own path, but her family's opposition left her feeling isolated and torn. Love had brought her to this moment, but the battle between her heart and her heritage was far from over. In Billy, Kathleen had found the happiness she had always longed for, yet the cost of that love was more than she could have imagined. As her story unfolded, it was clear that Kathleen's fight for independence was only just beginning. In the end, Kathleen's wedding day arrived on May 6, 1944, and it became a quiet act of painful defiance. The ceremony was simple, even stark, and only one member of her family stood beside her, her brother Joseph. As the celebrants spoke, Kathleen couldn't help but glance at the empty spaces where her mother and father should have been. Afterward, Joseph pressed her hand in silent support. She tried to smile through the weight of it all. "At least you're here," she whispered softly. But despite her best efforts, the absence of her parents cast a long, cold shadow over what should have been the happiest day of her life. Back in America, her mother Rose's bitterness spilled out in letters, revealing a pain Kathleen felt like a knife. Words like heartbroken and horrified filled each page, stinging as though Rose had spoken them face to face. Late at night, Kathleen would reread the notes, muttering to herself, "I'm sorry you feel that way." A moment that should have marked the beginning of a joyful new chapter instead became a symbol of the growing rift between Kathleen and her family, and a painful foreshadowing of the tragedies still to come. Just months after the wedding, Kathleen's fragile happiness was shattered. Her brother Joseph, the only family member who had dared to support her marriage, died suddenly when his plane exploded over the English Channel during a secret mission. The news arrived in a letter that Kathleen gripped with trembling hands. "Joe was there for me," she whispered through tears, realizing that she had lost the one ally who had truly been on her side. The silence of her English home now felt colder and emptier than ever. But the blows didn't stop there. Soon after, Billy, her new husband, answered the call of duty and left for the front lines in Europe. As he packed his gear, Kathleen stood nearby, her voice trembling with a mixture of love and dread. "Must you go so soon?" she asked quietly. Billy turned to her, his eyes filled with sadness but resolve. "I have to do my part," he said gently. Kathleen pressed her lips together and watched him walk out the door, a sinking feeling settling deep in her chest. What if fate takes him too, she thought, her worst fears bubbling to the surface. During their time apart, their connection lived on through letters exchanged across war-torn countries. "I miss you so terribly," Billy wrote in one letter. "I'm safe enough, but I ache for home, for you." Kathleen read his words under the dim light of a lamp, clutching the paper as if it could bring him back. She imagined him safe by her side, far away from the violence and uncertainty of the battlefield. But neither of them knew if they would ever be reunited again. The telegram hit her like a hammer blow. He had been killed at just 26 years old. Kathleen stood frozen, staring at the page as though willing the words to disappear. "This can't be," she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking. Already crushed by Joseph's death, this second loss was almost too much to bear. The details that followed were even more unbearable. Billy had been shot by a sniper while trying to liberate a small town in Belgium. Kathleen could only picture him on foreign soil, so close to doing something brave and good, only to be cut down in a single cruel moment. With a trembling hand pressed against her heart, she whispered bitterly, "He never stood a chance." The war made recovering Billy's body too dangerous. The army asked Kathleen for permission to bury him near where he fell. With tears streaming down her face, she agreed, knowing it was the right choice even as it broke her heart. "It's the least I can do," she said softly, her voice heavy with loss. She knew she would never see him again, and all she could do was imagine him at rest far from home. Grief became Kathleen's constant companion, weighing her down like a heavy cloak. After Billy's death, she briefly returned to America, hoping her family's familiar presence might bring her comfort. But she found no solace there. Words were left unspoken, arms stayed rigid at their sides, and Kathleen felt even more alone. "Is this all that's left for me?" she whispered to herself as she fled back to England. In the dark, rain-slicked streets of London, Kathleen wandered aimlessly, passing old familiar places that now felt hollow. Determined to escape the pain, she threw herself into a whirlwind of nightlife. She danced until her feet ached, laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, and flirted without care. Over cocktails in glittering salons, she would quip to acquaintances, "I've spent enough time with death, I'd rather live a little." But her reckless search for joy only masked the emptiness she carried inside. Then, into this fragile and chaotic world, stepped Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam, the 8th Earl of Fitzwilliam, better known as Viscount Milton. A soldier, a charmer, and an aristocrat, Peter captivated Kathleen almost immediately. During their first private conversation, she found herself murmuring, "You're different," as his steady, amused gaze met hers. But behind Peter's charm lay secrets of his own. Secrets that would soon pull Kathleen deeper into a story she wasn't prepared for. Peter's aristocratic elegance came with a glaring flaw. He was already married. His relationship with Olive Dorothea Plunkett, his wife, had crumbled into bitterness, fueled by her struggles with alcoholism. For Kathleen, this should have been a clear warning. It was a red flag she couldn't ignore, but she did. "He's trapped," she insisted to a friend one evening. "I understand what it's like to feel trapped." Yet deep down, Kathleen knew the truth. This affair was a scandal waiting to explode, and it could consume them both. Her heart told her one thing, but the reality of the situation told her another, and as Kathleen grew closer to Peter, the storm that was brewing around them grew impossible to escape. Kathleen's relationship with Viscount Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam quickly became the subject of whispers and scandal within London's elite circles. Friends who once admired her charm and boldness now distanced themselves, exchanging knowing glances and hushed gossip. At high society events, the couple's presence sparked murmurs of judgment, with one aristocrat sneering, "She's a Kennedy. Trouble follows them everywhere." Others accused her of tarnishing her family name, seeing her involvement with a married man as reckless and unbecoming. Despite this, Kathleen seemed unbothered on the surface, quipping to a friend one evening, "If they're talking, at least I'm not boring them." Behind the bravado, however, was a woman weighed down by loneliness and grief. Billy Hardington's death had left a void she couldn't fill, and Peter's attention offered both comfort and escape. To Kathleen, the affair wasn't simply rebellion, it was survival. Back in America, whispers of Kathleen's involvement with a married viscount began to reach the Kennedy family, and Rose Kennedy's fury reignited. Letters soon arrived, filled with sharp words and heavy disapproval. Each one grew colder, each warning more pointed. One letter ended with a chilling sentence, "If you persist in this course, you will be alone, Kathleen." Kathleen read the words and forced a bitter laugh, though her hands trembled. "Alone?" she murmured to herself. "I've been alone for years, in a crowd of my own family." Rose's threats didn't make Kathleen back down. Instead, they only fueled her defiance. Rather than retreat, she leaned further into her relationship with the Viscount. When he hinted that he might divorce his wife and marry her, Kathleen's heart skipped a beat. "You would do that for us?" she asked, searching his eyes for sincerity. For a fleeting moment, the weight of propriety and family expectation seemed to vanish, replaced by a spark of hope. Hope she desperately wanted to believe in, no matter how many times it had betrayed her before. But as Kathleen grew closer to the Viscount, his darker side began to show. Stories of his gambling, heavy drinking, and ruthless attitude toward money and power swirled around her. One evening over dinner, a concerned friend tried to warn her, "Kathleen, he's trouble." She smiled nervously, looking down at her wine glass. "I know," she admitted softly. Despite the warning signs, something about his rakish grin and the way he made her feel alive pulled her closer. Even as her instincts urged her to run, Kathleen couldn't bring herself to walk away. In moments of quiet reflection, Kathleen acknowledged his flaws. She confided to a close friend, "He reminds me of Rhett Butler, arrogant, selfish, and impossible to trust." Yet, the pull of the Viscount was undeniable. Instead of stepping back from what she knew was doomed, Kathleen charged forward, perhaps believing her sheer will could change their fate. Though Rose Kennedy openly opposed the relationship, Kathleen thought she might sway her father's opinion. When she heard that Joseph Kennedy Sr. would be in France on business in May 1948, she saw a chance to win him over. "If I bring him face to face with the Viscount in Paris, surely he'll understand," she told a friend, tapping her fingers restlessly on a desk. Kathleen hoped the romantic, sophisticated setting would cast her lover in a better light, making him seem worthy of her father's approval. Kathleen was used to charming any room she entered, and she convinced herself she could charm her father too. "If father meets him, he'll see what I see," she insisted, as if saying it out loud would make it true. She pictured the scene perfectly, her father disarmed by the Viscount's manners, nodding in approval, while she and her love shared laughter in a cozy Parisian cafe. Hope swelled inside her, pushing aside the quiet dread that this was yet another gamble she was destined to lose. On May 13, 1948, Kathleen and the Viscount boarded a small de Havilland DH 104 Dove plane headed from Paris to the French Riviera. Kathleen tried to ignore the rattling of the aircraft, focusing instead on the excitement of their secret getaway. She leaned toward the Viscount, teasing him with a smile. "If we can weather my family's storms, we can handle a bit of turbulence," she said, grateful for the stolen privacy they shared 3,000 feet above the ground. But an hour into the flight, everything changed. The plane plunged into a violent storm, the skies darkening as though fate itself had cast an omen. Radio contact was lost, and the aircraft bucked wildly in the gale. Kathleen gripped the armrest, her knuckles turning white. She turned to the Viscount, her voice shaking but determined. "Hold on. We'll get through this." For 20 agonizing minutes they clung to hope, enduring every lurch and drop as though the sky itself was trying to tear them apart. When the Dove finally broke through the storm, relief came only for a moment. Emerging from the clouds, the aircraft found itself in a deadly nosedive. The pilot fought desperately to regain control, pulling up just enough to delay the inevitable. Kathleen's heart pounded as she looked at the Viscount, her voice barely a whisper. "Just hold me." Fear stripped away pride, and she reached for him, as though love might somehow shield them from the cruel hand of fate. But fate had other plans. The plane's structure gave way under the strain. Wind and force tore off a wing, both engines and the tail. In those final, terrifying moments, no clever words, no Kennedy charm, no desperate prayers could save Kathleen or the others on board. The crash was instant, brutal, and final. News of the tragedy reached the Kennedys like a tidal wave. Rose Kennedy's absence at Kathleen's funeral was impossible to ignore, explained away as a sudden hospital stay, an excuse that rang hollow to those who knew the truth. Only Joseph Kennedy Sr. stood by his daughter's graveside, his face hidden behind dark glasses, his grief concealed but deeply felt. One can almost imagine Kathleen's spirit crying out, "Mother, where are you now?" But as always, there was no answer, only silence. Kathleen found her final resting place far from home, not among the Kennedys, but beside her beloved Billy Hardington at St. Peter's Churchyard in Edensor, England. The inscription on her gravestone reads, "Joy she gave, joy she has found," a bittersweet tribute to a life defined by passion, loss, and a fierce determination to live on her own terms. In the quiet English countryside, Kathleen Cavendish's story came to a close, a story of love, defiance, and the restless longing for freedom that followed her until the very end. If you've enjoyed this story or others like it, don't forget to show your support by subscribing and hitting the like button. Stay tuned for more informative and exciting stories just like this one.